FedExField stands on the outskirts of Washington, D.C., in Landover, Maryland, a place that for years was supposed to represent renewal, pride, and a new era for one of the most traditional franchises in American football. When it opened its gates in 1997, the stadium was not just concrete and steel, it was a promise. A promise that the Washington Commanders, then still known as the Washington Redskins, were entering a future worthy of their glorious past, a future that would honor decades of history built by legends, championships, and a fan base spread across the entire United States. The story of FedExField begins in the mid-1990s, a period of transition and ambition for the franchise. After decades playing at Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Stadium, the team needed a modern home, something larger, more profitable, and aligned with the growing commercial power of the NFL. Jack Kent Cooke, the iconic owner who had led the team to 3 Super Bowl titles in 1982, 1987, and 1991, was the driving force behind the project. He envisioned a stadium that would be the largest in the league, a monumental arena capable of hosting more than 80,000 fans and restoring Washington's dominance not only on the field, but also as a business powerhouse. Cooke passed away in April 1997, just months before the stadium was completed, never seeing his dream fully realized. His death cast a shadow over what was meant to be a triumphant moment. Still, in September of that same year, FedExField officially opened, named Jack Kent Cooke Stadium at the time. The first game, played on September 14, 1997, brought hope and emotion. Fans filled the seats, believing they were witnessing the dawn of a new golden age. In 1999, the stadium was renamed FedExField after FedEx purchased the naming rights, a deal that symbolized the growing marriage between corporate America and professional sports. From the outside, the stadium looked imposing. From the inside, it was massive, loud, and intimidating. For a brief moment, everything seemed aligned. Washington reached the playoffs that same year, fueling optimism that the stadium would become a fortress feared by opponents. But as the years passed, cracks began to appear, both literally and symbolically. FedExField quickly gained a reputation that no franchise wants. Despite being one of the largest stadiums in the NFL, it became notorious for poor design choices. Fans complained about obstructed views, long ramps, confusing layouts, and a general lack of intimacy with the field. Unlike newer stadiums built with fan experience as the central focus, FedExField felt cold, distant, and uncomfortable. The seats were far from the action, and the atmosphere often failed to match the expectations created by its size. On the field, the situation mirrored the stands. After the early 2000s, success became rare. Coaching changes became routine. Promising seasons collapsed unexpectedly. Big-name players arrived with fanfare and left quietly. What was meant to be a place where legends were forged slowly turned into a symbol of frustration. The ownership transition deepened the wounds. In 1999, Daniel Snyder purchased the franchise, becoming one of the youngest owners in NFL history. His arrival was initially greeted with excitement. Many believed a new, energetic owner would restore Washington to relevance. Instead, Snyder's tenure became one of the most controversial in modern sports history. Constant front office interference, questionable decisions, and a revolving door of coaches and executives created instability that seemed to seep into the very soil beneath FedExField. As seasons passed, the stadium became associated not with dominance, but with disappointment. Attendance began to decline. Once packed stands showed patches of empty seats, something almost unthinkable for a franchise that once boasted one of the most loyal fan bases in sports. Opposing fans often outnumbered Washington supporters, turning home games into awkward spectacles. Then came the injuries. FedExField earned an infamous reputation as one of the most dangerous playing surfaces in the NFL. Players from Washington and visiting teams alike suffered serious injuries on its turf. Star quarterbacks, key defenders, and rising talents saw seasons end abruptly after non-contact injuries that many blamed on poor field conditions. In 2012, quarterback Robert Griffin III one of the most electrifying players the franchise had seen in decades, suffered a devastating knee injury during a playoff game, an image forever linked to the stadium in the minds of fans. Throughout the 2010s, criticism intensified. Players openly voiced concerns. Coaches hinted at frustration. Analysts labeled FedExField a career killer, a place where potential went to die. Even basic amenities failed. Pipes burst, dumping sewage onto fans. Railings collapsed, injuring spectators. Water leaks soaked sections of the stands. Each incident chipped away at the stadium's already fragile reputation. What made the situation even more painful was the contrast with the past. This was a franchise once defined by discipline, excellence, and pride. Under legendary coach Joe Gibbs, Washington had been a model organization. FedExField, instead of honoring that legacy, seemed to betray it. By the early 2020s, the stadium had become a symbol of everything that went wrong with the franchise. When the team officially rebranded as the Washington Commanders in 2022, many hoped the change would mark a true fresh start. But the stadium remained, looming and unchanged, a reminder that rebranding alone could not erase decades of mismanagement. In 2023, a seismic shift finally occurred. Daniel Snyder sold the team to a group led by Josh Harris, ending one of the darkest eras in Washington sports history. With new ownership came renewed discussions about the future of FedExField. Reports emerged, suggesting that the stadium's days were numbered. The Commanders began exploring options for a new home, possibly returning to Washington, D.C., or building a modern arena in Virginia or Maryland. Today, FedExField stands as a paradox. It is the place where everything was supposed to begin again, where hope was meant to rise higher than the upper decks. Instead, it became a cautionary tale, a reminder that size, money, and ambition mean nothing without vision, care, and respect for tradition. For fans who have walked its ramps, sat through freezing losses, and watched dreams crumble under its lights, FedExField is more than a stadium. It is a chapter of pain, frustration, and unfulfilled promises. And yet, it is also part of the story, a necessary chapter in understanding what the Washington Commanders were, what they lost, and what they are still trying to become. In the end, FedExField is the NFL arena where everything begins with hope, and for far too long, ended in disappointment. Now imagine. In the mid-1990s, when the National Football League was entering a new era of commercialization, spectacle, and monumental architecture, a powerful vision was quietly taking shape just outside the heart of the United States Capitol. This vision did not begin with steel beams or concrete foundations, but with ambition, an almost obsessive belief held by one man that Washington deserved something greater, something unmatched, something that would stand not merely as a sports venue, but as a symbol of dominance, prestige, and legacy. That man was Jack Kent Cooke. By 1994, Jack Kent Cooke was already a towering figure in American sports. Born in Hamilton, Ontario in 1912, Cooke had built a business empire that spanned media, real estate, and professional athletics. He was not just the owner of the Washington football franchise. He was also a man who had tasted championships, influence, and respect at the highest levels of the sports world. Under his ownership, Washington had enjoyed periods of glory, including multiple Super Bowl victories. Yet despite all the success on the field, Cooke was deeply dissatisfied with one crucial element: the stadium. Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Stadium, known simply as RFK Stadium, had been the team's home since 1961. It carried history, emotion, and unforgettable moments. But by the early 1990s, it no longer matched Cooke's vision for the future. The NFL was changing rapidly. New stadiums were being built across the country, larger, more luxurious, and designed not only for football, but for massive revenue generation through luxury suites, sponsorships, and modern amenities. RFK, with its aging infrastructure and limited expansion possibilities, represented the past. Cooke was determined to build the future. Around 1994, Cooke began to openly discuss his dream of constructing the largest and most impressive stadium the NFL had ever seen. This was not merely about capacity, it was about making a statement. He wanted a fortress, a colossus that would intimidate opponents and inspire fans, a place where history would be made repeatedly. Washington, in his mind, deserved nothing less than the crown jewel of the league. The search for a location became one of the most critical decisions in the project. After extensive evaluations, attention turned to Landover, Maryland, a suburban area located just a few miles east of Washington, D.C. At the time, Landover offered something increasingly rare near major metropolitan centers: vast open land. The site provided easy access via major highways, including the Capitol Beltway, and had the potential to absorb the enormous traffic flow that a massive stadium would generate. More importantly, the area represented opportunity. Cooke and local planners envisioned not just a stadium, but an economic transformation, a catalyst that would turn Landover into a thriving hub of commerce, employment, and development. As plans began to solidify, the scope of the project grew more ambitious with each passing month. The proposed stadium would seat more than 90,000 fans, surpassing every other venue in the NFL. At a time when many teams were downsizing capacity in favor of exclusivity, Cooke moved boldly in the opposite direction. He believed in the power of numbers, in the spectacle of sheer scale. To him, a packed stadium of over 90,000 voices was not a liability. It was a weapon. Design discussions emphasized durability, visibility, and intimidation. The structure would rise steeply, ensuring that even fans in the upper levels felt close to the action. The exterior would project strength rather than elegance, reinforcing the idea that this was a football stronghold, not a decorative landmark. Every decision was driven by one core belief: this stadium would dominate the league. Construction preparations moved forward amid growing excitement and scrutiny. The estimated cost reached hundreds of millions of dollars, a staggering sum for the time. Yet Cooke remained unwavering. He saw the expense not as a risk, but as an investment in immortality. To him, this stadium would outlive trends, ownership changes, and even himself. It would be his enduring mark on the franchise and the league. Tragically, fate intervened before Cooke could see his vision fully realized. On April 6, 1997, Jack Kent Cooke passed away at the age of 84 after a battle with congestive heart failure. His death sent shockwaves through the NFL and the city of Washington. The man who had dreamed so boldly, who had pushed relentlessly for greatness, was gone just months before the stadium's completion. If this story made you look at the world of sports with different eyes, then you already understand why these narratives matter. Behind the bright lights, the packed stands, and the carefully polished broadcasts, there are stories that rarely make it to the surface, stories shaped by ambition, power, ego, silence, and consequences. These are not just tales about stadiums or teams. They are human stories, filled with decisions that changed destinies and structures that were meant to symbolize greatness, but ended up revealing something far more unsettling. This channel exists for those who refuse to accept the surface version of history. It is for people who want to know what really happened behind the scenes of the biggest arenas, the most celebrated franchises, and the most untouchable figures in sports. Here we dig into the moments that were quietly buried, the controversies that were softened by money, and the uncomfortable truths that powerful institutions would rather forget. Every story you find here is a reminder that glory often comes with shadows, and that understanding those shadows changes the way we see everything. By subscribing now, you become part of a community that is not afraid to question legends, revisit forgotten scandals, and expose the darker side of empires built on billions. Activate the notification bell so you never miss a story, because each one connects to a larger picture of how power operates, how silence is maintained, and how even the strongest fortresses can fall when accountability disappears. If you believe that history should be told in full, not edited for comfort, if you are drawn to stories that challenge official narratives and reveal what lies beneath success, then this is your place. Join us, subscribe, and walk with us through the untold side of the NFL and the global sports world. Because here, the story always goes far beyond the game. For a brief moment, uncertainty loomed. Would the project continue with the same intensity? Would Cooke's successors honor his original vision, or would compromises dilute the dream? Ultimately, the answer became clear. The stadium would move forward, not merely as a business venture, but as a tribute. It became a legacy project, a final chapter in Cooke's extraordinary career. Later in 1997, the stadium opened its gates to the public. Though it would eventually be known as FedExField, after naming rights agreements, its identity was already firmly established. With a capacity exceeding 91,000 seats, it immediately became the largest stadium in the National Football League. The numbers alone were staggering. From the moment fans began to fill the stands, it was clear that this was a place unlike any other. The inauguration represented more than the opening of a sports venue. It symbolized the arrival of a new era for the Washington franchise. Cutting-edge technology, modern concessions, expansive concourses, and unprecedented seating capacity all pointed toward a future filled with promise. Record-breaking attendance was expected, and expectations soared that the team would rise to match the grandeur of its new home. In Landover, the impact was immediate. Roads, infrastructure, and local businesses adapted to the influx of fans and media. What had once been a relatively quiet suburban area was now firmly embedded in the national sports conversation. Cooke's vision of economic transformation began to take shape as the stadium drew attention, investment, and development. Looking back at the period between 1994 and 1997, the birth of FedExField stands as a story driven by ambition, shaped by loss, and completed by legacy. It is the story of a man who refused to accept limitations, who believed that Washington should stand taller than the rest of the league, and who pursued that belief until his final days. Though Jack Kent Cooke did not live to witness the roar of 91,000 fans echoing through the concrete walls of the stadium, his presence was embedded in every beam, every seat, and every cheer. At the moment of its birth, everything seemed aligned for greatness. The largest stadium in the NFL. State-of-the-art design, a passionate fan base, a location primed for growth. The future appeared radiant, filled with visions of championships, unforgettable moments, and an unbreakable bond between team and city. FedExField was not just a stadium. It was a monument to ambition, a fortress built on dreams, and the final testament of one of the most powerful figures the NFL had ever known. By the late 1990s, the massive concrete walls of FedExField were still new, its seats barely worn, and its promise of greatness still echoing in the minds of fans across Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. From the outside, everything suggested stability and power. The largest stadium in the NFL stood proudly in Landover, Maryland, just miles from the U.S. Capitol, symbolizing ambition, wealth, and the belief that this franchise was destined to remain among the league's elite. Yet beneath that imposing exterior, a quiet but decisive shift was already underway, one that would forever alter the relationship between the team, its home, and its supporters. That shift began in 1999, a year that would later be recognized as one of the most consequential in the franchise's long and turbulent history. It was the year Daniel Snyder entered the picture. Daniel Snyder was not a former athlete, coach, or football executive. He was a businessman, young, aggressive, and intensely ambitious. Born in 1964, Snyder had built his fortune through marketing and advertising, most notably with Snyder Communications, a company that thrived during the booming 1990s economy. By his mid-30s, he had amassed enough wealth to pursue what many considered an impossible dream, owning an NFL franchise. When Jack Kent Cooke passed away in 1997, his estate placed the Washington team up for sale. The bidding process attracted powerful investors and well-known figures, but Snyder outpaced them all. In May 1999, at just 34 years old, he purchased the Washington Redskins for approximately $800 million, a staggering figure at the time, and one of the most expensive sports franchise transactions in history. The deal sent shockwaves through the league. Overnight, Daniel Snyder became the youngest owner in the NFL and one of its most talked-about figures. At first, there was cautious optimism. Many fans believed that Snyder's youth and financial power might usher in a bold new era. After all, he had grown up as a fan of the team, attending games at RFK Stadium as a boy. He spoke passionately about restoring glory, winning championships, and honoring the franchise's legacy. To some, he appeared as a devoted supporter who had finally gained the means to turn childhood dreams into reality. But it did not take long for the tone to change. Almost immediately, FedExField began to feel different, not physically at first, but philosophically. Under Snyder's ownership, the stadium was no longer treated primarily as a cathedral of football or a gathering place for a loyal fan base. It became instead a commercial engine. Every square foot was evaluated not for comfort or atmosphere, but for revenue potential. This shift marked the beginning of a new identity for the stadium, one that mirrored Snyder's business-first mentality. Structural changes soon followed. Seating layouts were altered to squeeze in more rows, reducing legroom and personal space. Areas once designed for general fans were reconfigured to accommodate premium sections, luxury boxes, and exclusive club seats. Prices rose steadily, not only for tickets, but for parking, concessions, and merchandise. FedExField, once promoted as a fan-friendly marvel, increasingly felt like a place where loyalty was measured by spending power. Journalists who covered the team during the early 2000s began to notice the contrast. On paper, the stadium was still a giant, over 91,000 seats, towering stands, and modern infrastructure. But in practice, the experience was deteriorating. Fans complained of cramped seating, obstructed views, and long lines. The grandeur promised during the Jack Kent Cooke era seemed to be fading, replaced by a sense that something essential had been lost. Players, too, felt the change. Visiting teams no longer described FedExField as an intimidating fortress. Home players quietly noted that the atmosphere felt increasingly corporate, less organic, less alive. The stadium was loud, but not always passionate. Full, but not always united. It was as if the soul of the place was slowly being diluted. Between 1999 and 2005, Snyder's influence grew steadily within the NFL. He was assertive in league meetings, unafraid to challenge traditions or push boundaries. Financially, he was one of the most powerful owners in the sport, and that power often shielded him from immediate consequences. Inside Washington's front office, decision-making became highly centralized. Snyder involved himself in nearly every aspect of operations, from marketing campaigns to football personnel decisions. This same centralization extended to the stadium itself. FedExField became a reflection of Snyder's personality, aggressive, profit-driven, and tightly controlled. Naming rights deals, sponsorship expansions, and exclusive partnerships multiplied. While these moves increased revenue, they further distanced the average fan. Attending a game began to feel less like a communal ritual and more like navigating a high-priced commercial environment. Despite growing discomfort, public criticism remained muted during the early years. The sheer scale of Snyder's investment, combined with his financial clout, discouraged open opposition. Many fans hoped that on-field success would justify the changes, that winning would make the sacrifices worthwhile. After all, discomfort is often tolerated when victories follow. But wins were inconsistent, and frustration simmered. By the early 2000s, whispers turned into conversations. Sports radio hosts in Washington questioned whether the stadium still served the fans. Columnists wrote about the irony of the NFL's largest venue feeling increasingly inhospitable. Longtime season ticket holders began to walk away, citing cost, comfort, and a growing sense of alienation. FedExField, once envisioned as the ultimate home field advantage, was slowly acquiring a different reputation. It was big, yes, but cold, impressive, yet impersonal, a monument to scale rather than spirit. Still, Snyder's grip remained firm. His wealth insulated him, and his influence within the league ensured that change would not come easily. The discomfort was real, but it lingered beneath the surface, overshadowed by marketing slogans, bold promises, and the constant assertion that better days were just ahead. Looking back, the years between 1999 and 2005 now feel like the quiet turning point, the moment when the foundation began to crack even as the structure stood tall. FedExField did not collapse overnight. Instead, it slowly transformed, reflecting the priorities of its new owner rather than the hopes of its community. What had once been a legacy project, born from Jack Kent Cooke's vision of greatness, was gradually reshaped into a commercial fortress. And while the stadium still loomed large on the landscape of Landover, Maryland, something invisible yet vital was slipping away. This era did not erupt in scandal or disaster. It unfolded quietly, decision by decision, seat by seat, dollar by dollar. And in that silence, the future struggles of FedExField and the franchise itself were already being written. As the second decade of the 21st century began, the massive structure rising from the plains of Landover, Maryland, still looked imposing from a distance. FedExField remained, at least visually, the largest stadium in the National Football League, a concrete giant capable of holding more than 90,000 people. Yet by 2010, the meaning of that size had changed. What was once interpreted as grandeur was now increasingly seen as excess. What once symbolized ambition now felt like neglect. Quietly at first, then unmistakably, the stadium entered the darkest chapter of its existence, a period in which its name became synonymous not with greatness, but with embarrassment, danger, and national humiliation. By this point, Daniel Snyder had been the owner of the Washington franchise for more than a decade. His influence was absolute. Decisions about football operations, business strategy, public messaging, and stadium management flowed upward, converging in a system that left little room for dissent. On the surface, FedExField continued to operate as an NFL venue, hosting games, concerts, and major events. But behind the scenes, cracks, both literal and figurative, were spreading. The first moment that truly shook public perception came in December 2010. On what should have been a routine game day, fans filled the stands as they always had, trusting the stadium to provide at least the most basic standard of safety. During the game, however, part of the upper deck railing collapsed, sending debris down and injuring several spectators. Emergency crews rushed in as confusion spread through the crowd. Though the injuries were not fatal, the incident was deeply unsettling. For the first time, FedExField was no longer just uncomfortable or overpriced. It was physically dangerous. Images circulated quickly. Television cameras captured the aftermath, and photos spread across news outlets and early social media platforms. Questions followed immediately. How could a modern NFL stadium allow such a failure? Why had maintenance issues gone unaddressed? The organization issued statements promising reviews and repairs, but for many fans, trust had already been damaged. A stadium is supposed to protect those inside it. That implicit contract had been broken. In the years that followed, the situation did not improve. Attendance declined steadily as long-time season ticket holders abandoned their seats. The stands that once echoed with noise and energy began to show patches of empty chairs, a startling sight in the league's largest venue. FedExField started to feel hollow, its size amplifying the silence rather than the excitement. Then came 2017, the year that would cement the stadium's reputation as a national punchline. During a game that season, fans seated in premium areas, sections for which they had paid some of the highest prices in the stadium, suddenly found themselves in a surreal and humiliating situation. Sewage pipes burst overhead, releasing foul-smelling waste that spilled directly onto spectators. Video footage quickly surfaced, showing fans drenched in what was unmistakably sewage, scrambling in shock and disgust. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. A stadium once marketed as elite, modern, and luxurious was now literally dumping waste on its most expensive customers. Sports networks replayed the footage repeatedly. Late-night hosts mocked the incident. Commentators across the country used it as a metaphor for the broader state of the franchise. Once again, the organization apologized. Once again, promises were made. But the damage was no longer limited to trust. It was reputational. FedExField was no longer simply criticized, it was ridiculed. By this point, visiting teams openly complained about conditions. Players described uneven turf, poor locker rooms, and a general sense that the stadium lagged behind the rest of the league. Agents warned clients about playing there. Fans from opposing teams, often outnumbering home supporters, filled the stands and turned Washington's supposed home field advantage into a weekly embarrassment. Yet the most defining moment of this dark era arrived in 2021. On September 12, 2021, during a game against the Philadelphia Eagles, a group of fans leaned against a protective railing near the tunnel where players exited the field. Suddenly, the barrier collapsed. Several fans fell forward, narrowly avoiding a much deeper drop. Eagles quarterback Jalen Hurts and other players rushed to help pull people to safety. The scene was captured on camera from multiple angles. Within minutes, it spread across the internet. Analysts, former players, and fans reacted with disbelief. Once again, the question was unavoidable. How could this happen in an NFL stadium in the modern era? Unlike previous incidents, this one involved players directly. That detail magnified its impact. The league could no longer dismiss stadium failures as isolated fan experience issues. Player safety was now part of the conversation, and that changed everything. As FedExField's physical problems piled up, an even more damaging storm was gathering around Daniel Snyder himself. Throughout the late 2010s and into the early 2020s, investigative reports began to emerge describing a deeply toxic workplace culture within the Washington organization. Former employees spoke of harassment, intimidation, and systemic mismanagement. Allegations included sexual harassment, verbal abuse, and an environment in which fear replaced professionalism. In 2020, major media outlets published detailed investigations, prompting the NFL to launch its own inquiry. The situation escalated further when the United States Congress became involved, opening investigations into whether the league had adequately addressed the allegations and whether Snyder himself had contributed to or ignored the toxic conditions. Suddenly, Snyder's name dominated headlines, not for business moves or football decisions, but for scandal. Congressional hearings, leaked emails, and testimony from former employees painted a grim picture of leadership failure. The owner, who once wielded financial power as a shield, now found himself under unprecedented scrutiny. FedExField, meanwhile, became a visual symbol of that failure. Its crumbling infrastructure mirrored the organizational decay being exposed off the field. Every broken railing, every maintenance lapse, every embarrassing incident reinforced the narrative that nothing under Snyder's control was truly functioning as it should. By the early 2020s, the stadium was routinely ranked among the worst in the NFL by players, coaches, and fans alike. Surveys conducted by the NFL Players Association highlighted poor facilities and unsafe conditions. Visiting teams dreaded trips to Landover. Washington fans openly called for a new stadium, or for Snyder to sell the team altogether. The transformation was complete. What had once been introduced in 1997 as the crown jewel of the league was now a cautionary tale. FedExField was no longer a place of pride. It was a symbol of what happens when ambition is disconnected from accountability, when profit eclipses responsibility, and when leadership refuses to listen. National broadcasts treated the stadium as a joke. Commentators referenced past incidents with a tone that mixed disbelief and mockery. For a franchise with a once-storied legacy, this was perhaps the greatest humiliation of all, not just losing games, but losing respect. Between 2010 and 2021, the collapse of FedExField's image was not sudden. It unfolded slowly, incident by incident, scandal by scandal. Each event stripped away another layer of credibility until the illusion of grandeur could no longer be maintained. The concrete still stood, the seats were still there, but the meaning behind them had changed completely. FedExField had become a monument, not to greatness, but to neglect, not to legacy, but to warning. In the eyes of the nation, it represented everything that had gone wrong with the franchise and its leadership. And as investigations continued and pressure mounted, one truth became impossible to ignore. The fall of the stadium's reputation was inseparable from the fall of the organization itself. What began as whispers of discomfort had evolved into headlines of disgrace. The fortress had become fragile. The symbol of dominance had turned into a national embarrassment. And for the first time since its opening, the future of FedExField, and the man who controlled it, felt profoundly uncertain. By the time the calendar turned to 2022, the story of FedExField had reached a point that few could have imagined back in the late 1990s. What once stood as a monument to ambition and scale now felt like a relic, still massive, still looming over Landover, Maryland, but stripped of meaning, energy, and hope. The stadium that had been built to symbolize dominance no longer inspired pride. Instead, it evoked fatigue, frustration, and a collective desire to move on. The final act of this long saga was not marked by celebration or nostalgia, but by quiet abandonment and an unmistakable sense that an era had ended in failure. In early 2022, the Washington franchise made what many fans considered an overdue admission. After years of declining attendance, relentless criticism, and mounting safety concerns, the organization publicly acknowledged its intention to leave FedExField behind. Though discussions about a new stadium had circulated for years, this announcement carried a different weight. It was no longer speculative or aspirational. It was an acknowledgement that the relationship between the team and its home in Landover was beyond repair. For the residents of Prince George's County, where the stadium had stood since 1997, the news landed heavily. Decades earlier, local officials had embraced the project with the promise of economic revitalization, job creation, and national visibility. For a time, those promises seemed plausible. But by the early 2020s, the surrounding area told a different story. Vast parking lots sat mostly empty except on game days. Businesses that once depended on crowds had closed or relocated. The infrastructure around the stadium aged visibly, mirroring the decline of the venue itself. FedExField had become an island of concrete surrounded by neglect. Inside the stadium, the atmosphere had changed completely. Entire sections were routinely tarped off due to low attendance. Opposing fans often outnumbered Washington supporters, transforming home games into weekly reminders of alienation. The roar that Jack Kent Cooke once imagined, a deafening wall of sound shaking opponents, had faded into scattered noise echoing through empty rows of seats. As the team prepared for the future, another long-anticipated moment arrived in 2023, one that would reshape not only the franchise, but the narrative surrounding FedExField itself. After years of pressure from fans, sponsors, media, the NFL, and even the United States Congress, Daniel Snyder agreed to sell the team. The sale marked the end of one of the most controversial ownership tenures in professional sports history. In July 2023, the Washington franchise was officially sold to an ownership group led by Josh Harris, a billionaire investor known for his involvement with the Philadelphia 76ers in the NBA and the New Jersey Devils in the NHL. The transaction was valued at approximately $6.05 billion, making it one of the most expensive franchise sales in the history of global sports. NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell approved the deal unanimously, signaling the league's collective desire to close a painful chapter. For many fans, the sale was emotional. It was not simply a business transaction. It was a release. Snyder's departure represented the end of years defined by scandal, dysfunction, and embarrassment. And yet, even as hope cautiously returned, FedExField remained, a physical reminder of everything that had gone wrong. Under Snyder, the stadium had become inseparable from his reputation. Every broken railing, every burst pipe, every injury, every lawsuit seemed etched into the concrete itself. By the time he left, FedExField was no longer just outdated. It was radioactive. Politicians hesitated to associate with it. Fans avoided it. Players openly criticized it. Within the league, it was routinely cited as one of the worst venues in professional football. Once the largest stadium in the NFL, FedExField now felt grotesquely oversized. Its scale no longer suggested power, but inefficiency. Its vastness amplified emptiness rather than excitement. Walking through the concourses felt like wandering through a forgotten structure, functional but lifeless, maintained only enough to survive another season. Landover itself seemed frozen in time, tethered to a stadium that no longer served its original purpose. While newer NFL venues across the country rose as mixed-use developments with restaurants, entertainment districts, and year-round activity, FedExField remained isolated, surrounded by asphalt and aging roadways. It was a vision from another era, stranded in a league that had moved on. Between 2022 and 2024, conversations about the future accelerated. Maryland officials, Washington, D.C. leaders, and Virginia politicians all entered discussions about potential new sites. Names like the RFK Stadium grounds in Washington resurfaced, loaded with historical symbolism. Each proposal carried the same underlying assumption: FedExField's days were numbered. And yet, despite its failures, the stadium's story carried a strange gravity. This was the place where record crowds once gathered, where hope had briefly flourished, where one of the most powerful owners in NFL history sought immortality. The tragedy of FedExField was not that it was built too big, but that it was managed too poorly, neglected too long, and defended too stubbornly by those in control. By 2024, the stadium existed in a kind of limbo, still standing, still hosting games, but emotionally abandoned. It was no longer the future, nor even the present. It was an obstacle, something to be endured until escape became possible. In the end, FedExField did not fall with an explosion or a final dramatic moment. Its collapse was slow, quiet, and deeply symbolic. It decayed under the weight of bad decisions, unchecked power, and a leadership culture that prioritized profit and control over safety, community, and trust. What began as a billion-dollar dream concluded as a cautionary tale taught in fragments, through lawsuits, investigations, empty seats, and public ridicule. The story of FedExField is ultimately not just about a stadium. It is about how vision can be corrupted, how legacy can be squandered, and how size and wealth alone are never enough to sustain greatness. In Landover, Maryland, the concrete giant still stands, but its meaning has been erased. What was once a fortress of the NFL ended as a forgotten landmark, an enduring reminder that even the largest empires in American sports can be undone, not by a single catastrophe, but by years of neglect, arrogance, and refusal to change. As this story reaches its final breath, one question lingers in the air, heavier than the echoes of empty stadiums and broken promises. How many other places like this exist, hiding behind bright lights, massive structures, and carefully crafted legends? FedExField is not an isolated case. It is only one chapter in a much larger book, one that few dare to open, and even fewer are willing to read all the way to the end. Across the world of professional sports, especially within the NFL, there are arenas that look flawless on television, franchises wrapped in glory, and empires built on trophies and tradition. But behind the scenes, beneath the concrete, steel, and branding, there are stories rarely told. Stories of ambition that turned into obsession, of power that went unchecked, of decisions made in boardrooms that quietly shaped the fate of thousands of fans, players, and communities. These are not fairy tales. They are real histories, written with real consequences. This channel exists for one purpose: to go where the spotlight doesn't want to linger. Here, we don't stop at the scoreboard. We don't end the story when the final whistle blows. We dig deeper into the origins, the turning points, the scandals, the silence, and the moments when everything began to fall apart. We revisit legendary stadiums and powerful franchises not to glorify them, but to understand them. To expose how greatness is built, and more importantly, how it is destroyed. If the rise and fall of FedExField surprised you, imagine how many other arenas carry similar ghosts. Imagine how many icons of American sports hide uncomfortable truths behind billion-dollar facades. From historic NFL venues to modern mega-stadiums, from celebrated owners to disgraced executives, there is always more beneath the surface than the league wants you to see. By subscribing, you become part of a community that refuses to accept the official narrative at face value. A community that believes history is not just what is celebrated, but also what is buried. Here, we explore the untold chapters, the controversies that were silenced, the warning signs that were ignored, and the decisions that changed everything. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story, because each one builds on the same question. What really happened here? Every video is an invitation to look beyond the glamour and confront the uncomfortable reality behind the world's greatest sports stages. This is where legends are re-examined, empires are questioned, and myths are dismantled piece by piece. If you're tired of sanitized stories and surface-level narratives, you're in the right place. If you believe that the true history of sports is found not only in championships but in failures, scandals, and consequences, then this channel was made for you. Join us. Stay curious, stay critical, and remember, here, the story never ends at the game.